I was about to speak with the mute on. Welcome, all beloveds of life's urges and yearnings who move along the many riverbeds and channels of spirit, journeying toward truth and meaning. These pathways have been forged by a multitude of ancestors and processes over the 4.5 billion years of Earth's existence. They are carved into life's DNA by the power of moving waters within, among, between, and beyond. Let us breathe ourselves into the paradox of this tiny moment from our infinitesimal selves that are also the one dignified expression of life each of us is blessed to captain, and thereby is our own brightest shining star, our treasure in the Milky Way of life and love. Each week we gather at the edge of the river of life and enter into the gift of a Sabbath time where we can name the sacred and the holy as they have touched our lives and as we hope to make them real. For some, this gathered community of liberal religious faith may become a raft on that river of life. Open your mind and your heart as Olga brings us together at the river. The words were printed in the order of service sent out this morning if you'd like to look at them as you listen. Thank you. Thank you, Olga.
Shall we gather at the river where bright angels' feet have trod, with its crystal tide forever flowing by the throne of God? Yes, we'll gather at the river, the beautiful river, gather with the saints at the river that flows by the throne of God. On the margin of the river, washing up in silver spray, we will walk and worship ever on a happy golden day. Yes, we'll gather at the river, the beautiful river, gather with the saints at the river that flows by the throne of God. Here we reach the shining river, lay we every burden down. Grace of spirits will deliver and provide a robe and crown. Yes, we'll gather the river, the beautiful river, gather with the saints at the river that flows by the throne of God. Soon we'll reach the shining river, soon our pilgrimage will cease, soon our happy hearts will quiver with the melody of peace. Yes, we'll gather at the river, the beautiful river, gather with the saints at the river that flows by the throne of God.
Thank you, Olga. That was lovely, and I had to sing along, and many of you may have felt the same way. We gather by the river of life with the saints, listening for a melody of peace, to heal, to honor, to hope, and to open to our deeper truths about the multitude of unexpected challenges and wounds and disruptions of this past pandemic year. We mourn the river of death and its immensity in this year, immensity perhaps beyond our imagining of almost 2.5 million people who have died worldwide. It has been more or less a year since this global pandemic has come into and changed our lives. In the Jewish tradition, the anniversary of each particular death is marked by loved ones lighting a yahrzeit candle and reciting a prayer. Yahrzeit is a Yiddish word, and it simply means the year's anniversary, a year's time. The lighting of a yahrzeit candle and the reciting of a prayer is not a biblically mandated act. It derives instead from custom, a custom born from generations of gathered wisdom about the needs of grieving. We need to grieve. It is impossible to avoid it. Today and through the end of March, we invite ourselves into a season of worship titled Holy Vessels, a season to call ourselves into reflection upon our deeper natures, our actions or inactions, our gains and losses. We begin this morning with our grief as we mark a year of pandemic. On March 14th, when we come together again, we will acknowledge the losses and the gifts of a year of online services. With respect for the tradition from which it comes, we light our chalice this morning, echoing Yahrzeit, and with gratitude for the wisdom of marking the 1 year anniversary of a death. We know that each day of the coming year and beyond will be a day of Yahrzeit for millions of individuals and families. This morning, Donna Morris has graciously agreed to light our chalice. If you have a chalice or a candle with you, take this moment to light it, as I will also do.
Me now. We light this chalice, symbol of our liberal faith tradition, to illuminate our griefs and losses. May we see through the prism of our tears and sadness. Life on us often wanes. No one ever those who have died. No one thing may replace what has been lost. No new dream, no individual, no new hope or love will take their place. Nor will healing remove the loss, nor undo the breaking of our former realities. Thus, we illuminate our memories, and most of all, the love and hope held within them. And still, may this chalice illuminate those deeper truths, that love can be found again in time. Indeed, it is all around us. That dreams need not be buried forever. We are allowed new dreams. That hope can light a pathway forward into a life forever changed. To be human is to suffer loss. Therefore, we illuminate that we are not alone.
Thank you, Donna. Thank you for the beautiful reading and that absolutely stunning flower this morning. May we all blossom. The Christian season of Lent began on Ash Wednesday, which was February 17th this year. Lent always begins with an acknowledgement of our mortality with these words from the burial service in the Anglican Book of Common Prayer: ashes to ashes and dust to dust. The more full reading of it is, we commit this body to the ground, earth to earth, ashes to ashes, dust to dust. Why focus on our mortality? Why should we, Unitarian Universalists, speak of death when it is the gift of life we celebrate? Because death is the boundary of this one precious wild life. Thank you once again, Mary Oliver. Each of us chaperone. No one escapes death. No one's life is untouched by death. It comes when it comes. It is, though we are often loath to say this in our culture, it is beyond our control. Death and loss are the elements. If we but allow them, they can assist us in shaping lives well lived. Their closest companion is grief. We may too often think of grief as simply one more emotion over which we may be able to exercise our individualistic control. But grief is not solely an emotional experience. It is also a physical experience. And when we do not acknowledge our own grief, personally or collectively, it ends up getting projected onto others and invariably creates some level of harm to ourselves and to others. Grief needs time. Grief needs boundaries. Boundaries that others who themselves are not in the immediacy of our grief can often help us to hold. In our dominant US culture, physical death and physical grieving have too long been treated as acts and seasons of shame. Shame to be hidden from sight, hidden from our shared experience, shut away in nursing homes or behind the closed curtains of intensive care units. And too often, their work has been left and deemed as only worthy of our lowest paid workers. Grief makes us vulnerable and needy and deeply uncomfortable in a culture dedicated to convincing us that we must to be successful, always in control of our own outcomes and experience. And yet, each of us carry stones of grief at some time, often perhaps through the course of our lives. Deborah is unable to be with us this morning, but she has provided us with this time for the generations to look at those stones.
This has been a year in which we have all given up a great deal. In a long season filled with suffering and loss, it has been difficult to endure. In his Lenten practice, Mark Burrows reminds us that we can seek solace in acts of healing. He shares, breathing is an act of healing. Telling the truth is an act of healing. Telling our stories is an act of healing. Embracing our creativity is an act of healing. Praying is an act of healing. I have a brief meditation that I'd like to share this morning as an act of healing. In the Jewish mystical tradition, stones are referred to as domim, or silent beings. They say that the stones have wisdom to teach us, that they represent eternal knowing and remembering. I invite you this morning into a time of guided meditation. So sit comfortably with the stone or what you have brought in the palm of your hand. Allow yourself to drift into a place of calm awareness, either with your eyes closed or cast downward. Open yourself to the presence of the stone in your hand. Feel in your body that you and the stone are resting upon the earth. Feel the weight of the stone in your hand. Notice the surface of the stone as you guide your fingers across its surface. Is it entirely smooth? Is there some texture to it? Are there sharp edges? Continue to hold the stone and notice it started cool to your touch and now may be growing warm as the heat from your own body is shared with the stone. Take this moment to feel the silence. You and the stone are sharing this place, this moment. I invite you now to think of other stones that may be in your life. The symbolic stones that you carry with you as you wake each day. Perhaps they are stones of sadness, or regret, or fear, a burden, a loss. We all have stones that we carry around with us. Turn your attention to the weight of these feelings in your being and notice that as you think of the stones that you carry, the stone that you are holding may be feeling heavier and heavier in your hand. It may even grow so heavy that you need to rest it in your lap. So heavy are the burdens we carry. And now we turn our attention to those around us. When you are ready, open your eyes and see the people that are here on our Zoom with us today. We can see that we each carry these burdens from day to day. We know that we can offer our support to one another as we continue on with courage, strength, and grace. Know that whatever you carry, you are not alone. There are others ready to listen and to offer their support. May it be so, and blessed be.
Let us gather our burdens as our ancient Hebrew ancestors did in a time of their exile, and bring them to the waters of life that swirl and stir with our longing to return to the time before we were grieving, before we had these particular burdens. Let us join with Olga, muting ourselves on screen, in singing our lament for the burdens carried, the vulnerable grief we carry today, and the treasure of our own being. As Olga leads us from this video, which she did so we can experience this lament and sing along as a round. All these joys, sorrows, and concerns in our hearts. Let us sing together, draw the circle wide. Let us join together and prepare ourselves for the spirit of prayer. Our prayer this morning comes from Alla Renee Bozarth. O earth, wrap me in your leaves and heal me. Let me fall on your earth breast, feed me. Sing to me under the round nests in your cedar trees. Embrace me when I sleep in your shade. Let your eye keep me protected and cool. Hide me. Warm me with naked summer kisses and cloister me around with wildflowers. Refresh me with springs and living waters. Draw me down into your well of rebirth and let my wounds open and empty into your wonderful compost heap. Then fill me with your fruit and bread Start over. Let my wounds become fertile gardens, and let me be. Let me live again. Amen. Another Jewish tradition around death is to place those stones, those dominim, silent ones, on the graves of loved ones. Several years ago, I traveled to Victoria, Texas to place stones on the grave of a grandfather I had never been allowed to meet. Some 50 years after he had died, I placed those stones from a religious tradition I had not been raised to practice because my grandfather had remained faithful in his own way through his 90 plus years of life. I have no actual memory of the day I was told my father's father had died, but I know this much. The news of this death was delivered by my mother out of my father's presence, and in about the same tone of voice in which I was told to take the dishes into the kitchen for washing or get down to the business of doing my homework. Not another word was ever said about this grandfather, nor of his surviving spouse, who was not my biological grandmother. We attended no service. We were told no further details of his life nor his death. And as you may have figured, there was little spoken about him before he died. My mother often said we were a family that did not do death. Perhaps you too came from such a family. No wailing, no weeping, no wakes, no Shiva. The fact of necessary observable social rituals were attended to with distaste and a tough upper lip. I believe my mother of blessed memory fancied herself right next to the young Queen Elizabeth and her mother in imitating their regal public stoicism around death. With each stone I placed on my grandfather's grave on that beautiful sunny day in Texas, I offered a prayer. Not some ritual prayer. I don't know those. But words from my heart spoken to the grandfather I would have liked to have known and been able to speak with in person. Some of the prayers were just questions. Where did he come from exactly? Who are my long lost relatives in Latvia? Did they survive the Holocaust? What was it like to be a Marxist at the end of the 18th and early 19th century? For I'd wheedled that much information out of my mother once. Why did he choose to live on a vegetarian commune in the 1920s? A tidbit I picked up from his daughter, my aunt. How much, I wanted to know, did it cost him to be separated from his 2-year-old son, my father? What was his grief like? How did he survive it? I also offered a prayer for the forces that kept us apart, kept us from knowing one another, from coming to love one another in that personal affection way. Perhaps you too come from a family where this kind of distancing, also known as cutoff, is part and parcel of your family's emotional DNA. It is not so for all families, but for some. Others come together as just as fiercely. Families cut off from one another, sibling to sibling, children to parents, parents from children, for all sorts of reasons. Some of them are perfectly rational. Sometimes families are physically cut off by death and by distance. Sometimes they are forced to cut off by unjust enslaving practices such as those we white identified folks and our white culture of domination used when we enslaved Africans, removed children from their parents, and engaged in a similar practice when we stole the land from the native people who lived here, and again when we took their children away to enculturate them in boarding schools, embodying white, Euro, Christian values of dominance. Sometimes we remove ourselves from families in whose soil we could not thrive, and it is a wise removal. Sometimes we remove ourselves from practices of abuse and disrespect so we can determine for ourselves what it is we need to thrive in the art of living. These are acts of grief: the cutoff, the distancing. If we take grief and grief work seriously as a serious spiritual practice, a soul healing time, then we need to find the ways to face our griefs. And for those of us for whom it's relevant, the griefs of these kinds of cutoffs. Cutoffs from religion of origin, as my family did. Whether these cutoffs happen in our personal and nuclear families, or whether they occur in the history of our church communities, or of our political communities, or of our country. This is our spiritual work. It is faithful and noble work. For my grandfather, I began this work late in life. I am still working on it. It took me a long time to even discover I had this grief. It is an experience in grief in direct contrast to my own father's death only 12 years after his father. On hearing of my father's expected death from the cancer, I remember the very physical experience of my world being torn apart. Within moments, the world around me appeared distant as though I were standing on a balcony above my body. This experience lasted for a few days. Then there was a long time of experiencing my father as with me as I negotiated grieving and healing over the next year and even the next few years. We all grieve in our own way. There is no right or wrong way to grieve. There are practices that help us lean into the grieving, and others that in general support that cutoff from our own grief process. You know what they are. Things like drinking too much alcohol, speeding up our activities so that we never slow down long enough to feel the pain. Which is not to say that most of us don't do some of both of those activities in the process of grieving. But they become a problem when they are our only way to process grief because we cannot process it. I can't help but wonder if the early white settlers here, having experienced their own cutoff and being sent away and trauma of the travel to this new, unusual, strange land that was inhospitable to their ways when they got here, if in not grieving, they became instead somewhat arrogant, born of holding the pride that they would not break down in grief. And instead, they unleashed their grief onto the native peoples and land around them. Over the generations, that became ingrained and enculturated into policy and into righteous intellectual rationalizations about civilizing others. Grieving is imperative spiritual work for our well-being. And because it is hard work, most of us avoid it. So our faith traditions provide us with these valued seasons to reflect, enter into, and process our griefs as we recognize our mortality so that we might live life more fully. As we were preparing for this service with the worship team and I, Chris Woodcock shared a beautiful and powerful story about one of his own experiences with grief. I invited him and he agreed to share this with you this morning. Chris?
Thanks. I think I'm unmuted. Some 25 years ago, tragedy struck my family. It was a warm July day. I was on the witness stand providing expert testimony at the Rhode Island Public Utilities Commission when the proceedings were suddenly halted and the chair announced a brief recess. She leaned over to me and said I had an important phone call I could take in her office. It was my mother telling me that my 18-year-old nephew was missing at sea. Because reports of the tragedy were coming out on the radio, she wanted to tell me first. The evening before, there was an odd storm that swept in and out. The sky darkened quickly, very dark and ominous, and then cleared. And I still remember how Corey remarked that she had a bad feeling about this. My nephew, Peter, worked at a boatyard in Falmouth Harbor in Cape Cod with two of his longtime friends, Amy and Mark. They had all grown up on the ocean. They knew the winds and currents as well as anyone that age could. They also knew that they should never take a small Boston whaler over to Martha's Vineyard. But it seems it was a rite of passage and everyone did it. A sudden squall hit them on their way back. It was about a mile from the vineyard. It tipped them over in big waves. None of them had their life preservers on. After all, they were 18 years old. They were invincible. Mark hit his head badly on something as the boat flipped and got a very bad cut on his head. The life preservers were all trapped underneath the upside down boat. Every time they tried to swim under to get it, the waves knocked the boat into them or hit them. It was very hard for them to stay on top of the tipped over boat. They could see the shore. It was getting darker out. No one knew where they were, where they had gone. They were all strong swimmers. So Amy was picked up by the Coast Guard the next day. They said she survived when the boys didn't because she had a cap on her head and it helped keep the heat in. Amy saw Her two best friends died that night. One by one, first Mark and then my nephew Peter, were taken by the overwhelming and endless power of the water. The currents were too strong. The water was chilling after hours. It's odd how grief can impact someone. Like Abigail, I was brought to have a stiff upper lip. I recall that day I got the call going back to the witness stand after the phone call. Somehow the word of Pete's accident had been circulated around the courtroom. The commission suggested that they suspend the proceedings, but I recall thinking there was nothing I could do. There was no new information that was likely to be forthcoming in the next few hours. I'd be left to obsess with questions that I just could not answer. I was far more comfortable responding to questions that I could answer and explaining things that I could explain. I urged the commission to continue with the proceedings, which we did. That evening, I was scheduled to go to a baseball game. I was told that, of course, I would not go. But like earlier, I felt going was better for me than not going. I can still remember the seat I was sitting in at Fenway Park and who sat where at that game. I have a strong memory of starting to feel the impact of what may have happened to Pete. I really don't remember much about the baseball game. The next day, Corey and I and all our kids went to my sister's house, Pete's mom. Much of the family had gathered along with the family of the other two kids. Amy, the girl who had survived the accident, was also there. To deal with her grief, she had to be with everyone. She had to tell her story. I don't know how she did it. Years later, she married Mark's brother, the brother of the friend that had drowned. As I learned more about what had happened that night, the reality of Pete's passing grew. We went to the beach that night. Sitting in the sand, we looked out to where it had all happened. It was a clear night. The waves weren't particularly big. The ocean almost seemed calm that night. The awesome power of the ocean. Mother Nature. It all became more and more apparent. She that gives us everything we need for life can take it away in an instant. As President Biden told us the other night, we never get over the loss of a loved one. But one day, the memories of that person stop bringing tears and instead bring a smile. Thinking of Peter now brings me a smile. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. And I just want to give us all a moment to just breathe. That was a very powerful sharing. If we allow ourselves to make grief a sacred and holy experience, one that gathers us as family, as community, as friends, as neighbors, then perhaps we will be able to find newer and deeper treasures of life and of ourselves as treasure in this life than we had ever imagined. Grief over our physical losses, as well as the loss of hopes and dreams and plans, may be both our burdens and our treasures. One of the treasures may be the recognition that in our own neediness and vulnerability, there is a deeper understanding of how much we need one another, a letting go of the arrogance and what I would call hard hearted pride, which is not the same as being proud of one's accomplishment, but the hard hearted pride that keeps us thinking, we can do this alone, I can do this by myself. Provides a humility about our limitations and a thoughtfulness, as Chris pointed out, about what we really can control and not control in living. The ocean is powerful, and the things we have to learn to accept with grace. Perhaps in seeing our own lack of control or recognizing the limits to what we do control, to learn and become acquainted with our human clumsiness in the face of the natural messiness of life's physical beginnings and endings. Perhaps we may be inspired to bring to our own living a bit more of the grace and extension, as we may notice it in the art of dance through such greats as Isadora Duncan or Mikhail Baryshnikov, or as we feel it in a stone that has been washed by ages of water and earth, of pressure and air and sun, and hold our burdens just a little more lightly. In allowing ourselves the gift of grieving, of carrying our stones of burden and treasure, we offer our greatest gift to the source of all, to God, to the unnamed and unknowable, to Mother Nature, treasuring the depth of our own being so that the waters of life and of spirit flow freely until that moment when our own bodies can no longer sustain life. Let us raise our voices in joy and gratitude. Muted, however, on your computer with one another and through Olga's gifts, singing every time. Hold this.
Every time I feel the spirit moving in my heart, I will pray. Yes, every time I feel the spirit moving in my heart, I will pray. Up on the mountains, my God's fall. On the mountains, hearts fall. All around.
Reverend
Reverend
Abigail, you're
Abigail, you're
speaking to mute.
Thank you. As we go forth, feeling the Spirit, with these words from Wayne Arneson, take courage, beloveds. The way is often hard. The path is never clear, and the stakes are very high. Take courage, for deep down there is another truth. You are not alone. Bravo. Thank you, Olga.